The primary and essential role of personal understanding in these times of seismic change. Bruce Charlton. How is it that we can live in a world where people's ideas are so very wrong, where their aspirations are so distorted and trivial, when not actually evil, which is common enough, where there is not even the most basic awareness of these times as ones of seismic spiritual and geopolitical change, and insofar as there is awareness is a kind of value inversion, leading to the opposite of virtue, truth and beauty. How come all this can be true, and yet there be so much virtue in the world, beauty in our surroundings, decent truthfulness between people, even strangers, enough people doing a good job that things continue? How can this be, when the entirety of public discourse, officialdom, the mass media, gossip and chit-chat, is so utterly wrong? What is the origin of the undoubted but invisible good that is implied by so much of our world, when there is so much more obvious, evil? These times of Western civilizational collapse are not, in any deep or significant way, a recapitulation of any earlier civilizational collapse, and, indeed, I think it is probable that each earlier collapse was at heart unique, with only superficial similarities. Here and now, I feel that the role of individual understanding is primary, it is what we ought to be doing. And, insofar as there are good things in life now, it is because of understanding, rather than, for instance, because of actions. What I mean is that human consciousness is currently operating in uncharted territory. By adulthood we each have, all but, lost that spontaneous and immersive groupishness that our ancestors experienced. The further back in time, the more groupish, and the less individually autonomous. There are many consequences. One is that the traditional forms of groupishness, for example extended familia/clans, guilds and unions, professions, villages, occupations, are either absent, destroyed or neglected to death, or weak, and/or assimilated to totalitarian bureaucracy. In other words, spontaneous groupishness has been displaced and replaced by top-down bureaucracy, and there is no other form of effective groupishness. Ultimately, this is because people do not now spontaneously and inevitably fall into groupishness as they once did, and people have chosen instead to grasp at whatever groupishness is most easily on offer. And what is on offer here and now is the groups created and sustained by the totalitarian establishment. So, we find ourselves as natural/inevitable individualists, we don't fall into groups naturally, and the overwhelming response in the West has been a choice to ally with whatever non-spontaneous groups are in our environment. And all of these groups are already, and increasingly, part of the global system. However, if we regard the waxing individualism and autonomy of men through known history as part of divine destiny, then in the first place we see that individual freedom and choice, and therefore personal responsibility, has become unavoidable, and secondly that it is of essential significance how we choose. Since we now just are individuals, and because God makes this world, then individuals have, thrust upon them, a much greater significance than in the past. The actual nature of the 2023 world can be seen as directing us, herding us, channeling us, each towards what we ought to be doing, while of course, the decision of what specifically to do, which way to jump, necessarily remains our own. The world brings us to the point of choice, and then we each choose. God has a definite preference how we should choose, but God cannot compel us to make that choice, and would not wish to compel us. So we find ourselves in a world where any group we might decide to join is either too weak to make a physical difference, or else a part of the problem. Any effective action we might take, has been preemptively neutralized, or indeed weaponized against us. This sounds bad, but if we simply accept this reality, and start from where we actually are, then we can see that other possibilities have opened up, even as the old groupish ones have closed. If only we become aware of, then reject, the assumption, so widely held, that our thoughts do not matter, and do not affect the world, then we may realize that individual autonomy enables each person to affect the world by his own thinking, in ways that were never possible before, because thinking was never previously so individual, was always previously, to a significant extent, increasing as we move further back into the past, a part of groupishness. In the past, people could not, and did not want to, could not even conceptualize thinking as individuals. But now we can hardly avoid doing so. We now, for the first time, in a widespread fashion, have the ability to understand as individuals, evaluate as individuals, and personally decide upon what we want and where our allegiance is allocated. And, so long as we recognize that thinking just is effectual in changing the world, that thinking changes that world, that every choice has real-life outcomes, this automatically and inevitably means that when we understand something and, after evaluating it, make a choice as to whether we personally endorse or oppose it, we are making a difference. That process of thinking, that sequence of thinking, makes a difference to reality, and in the direction we choose. Each individual has immense power located in his thinking. But, that power is only individual, only our power, when thinking is individual, when we take responsibility for our thinking and our choices. The vast changes of society towards individualism can therefore be understood as putting each of us into a position where we are confronted by choices which we can either embrace and learn from, or else deny and hide from. It hinges on understanding. Do we recognize that understanding is the most important, and necessary, thing we can do, when confronted by life? The prerequisite of any possibility of good. Or do we accept the establishment line that thoughts are just in the head and it is only by effective physical action, and therefore by action in groups, that we may live well? What makes a successful pilgrimage, and why? Bruce Charlton. In relation to my post from earlier today, which emphasized the role of individual, autonomous thinking in the world, a recent visit to Glastonbury seems relevant. Glastonbury has unsurpassed importance in the deep, and mythical, as well as historical, nature of Christianity in the British Isles. Yet since the 1970s, it has become a magnet for a New Age neo-paganism, that is anything but Christianity in its basic stance. This, even when New Age neo-paganism weaves in versions of Christian legends about Jesus visiting Somerset as a child, the site of the first Christian church in Britain, and perhaps the first outside Palestine, a foundational role of Joseph of Arimathea, and the influences of the Holy Grail, also, perhaps, the spear of destiny. Thus, many of the people encountered in and around Glastonbury are on the anti-Christian side in the spiritual war of this world. On the other hand, Glastonbury was the chosen residence, and spiritual focus, of the recently deceased writer Geoffrey Ashe, which counts for something positive in my book. So, the situation is that the surface and social aspects of Glastonbury are mostly hostile and aversive to my kind of Christian spirituality, while the depths and resonances are tremendous. A visit therefore depends, even more than visits usually do, on the attitude we bring to the place. I think this is the case nowadays, with our autonomous consciousness, than it was in the past. For example, in ancient times and into the Middle Ages, it seems that a place of holy pilgrimage would have an objective and essentially irresistible beneficial effect on the pilgrim. But, even if so, that is certainly not the case anymore. To physically move oneself to what was called the holiest earth in England is no longer beneficial unless one brings the right frame of mind. So much is clear from observing modern pilgrims, or hearing them talking about their experiences. This recent visit was with my brother, and focused on the ruins of Glastonbury Abbey, seeking books by Dion Fortune and Gareth Knight in the esoteric bookshops, the Chalice Well, and the Holy Thorn on Weary Old Hill. For, no doubt, a combination of reasons, our visit to Glastonbury was successful in terms of pilgrimage. We were able to see through whatever was aversive about the surface and many of the people, and experience what lay deeper. The question that comes to me now is whether this benefit was wholly explicable in terms of perceiving the past shining through the present. And I think not. I think that the past as such has not this power, and what we are actually experiencing in such situations is the effect of living thinking of the alive, and the so-called dead people for whom Glastonbury is a living spiritual resource. In other words, perhaps we are dealing with something much like what ritual magicians term thought forms, or something like Jung implied by archetypes. The positive, holy, creative thoughts of Christians have made a living, always present spiritual resource that may be tapped into by those who share such motivations. To tap into such thought forms does not require geographical proximity, yet the complex of attitudes and actions required to place oneself in Glastonbury, and to move around it in an attitude of expectation, can shape the mind to become especially receptive. And, not only receptive. Having linked to a thought form, our own thinking will, to some extent, modify, add to, enhance that thought form, and it is our experience of this participation that is exactly what makes a pilgrimage special and beneficial. Day or Night Dweller. Francis Berger.
God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night. But does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day?
William Blake, Auguries of Innocence. So where do you dwell? Night or day? Failing the Litmus Tests. William Wildblood. I read recently that as much as 80% of spiritual communities went along with the patently false propaganda of 2020 and got masked, pecked and all the rest of it. This is a staggering proportion, given that such people should be aware of what lies behind appearance and, further, should be focused in the eternal rather than the transitory. Why such a failure of understanding? As I see it, there are several reasons the people in these spiritual communities failed these litmus tests, as Bruce Charlton has accurately dubbed them. First, and most obviously, they lack discernment, but why is this? I believe much of it comes down to motivation. It is not sufficiently appreciated that the reason someone takes to the spiritual path is more important than the fact that they do. There are only two valid reasons. One is a fierce passion for truth. You know there is more out there than is generally recognized, and you will not rest until you uncover as much of this as you can. People who fall into this category will not have been misled by the lies and deceit of the recent past. They may not have been able to put their finger on exactly what was going on, but they will have felt a profound dissatisfaction with what was presented as fact. To put it bluntly, it smelt very bad. The other reason for taking to the spiritual path is a love of God. In fact, these two reasons are by no means exclusive. There may be a different emphasis to begin with, but the more one travels on the path, the more these two come together and become the same thing. For the person who loves God, the machinations of man are evident because these machinations come from a rejection of God. The closer one gets to God, the easier it is to discern worldly lies that spit in God's face. Am I saying that people in spiritual communities who went along with the propaganda don't have sufficient zeal for truth or love for God? Yes, I am saying precisely that. They failed the test because they were more concerned with themselves than they were with God or truth, and therefore they may have been in spiritual communities, but they were not real spiritual people by any of the criteria that matter. I will concede that it may not have obvious to everyone straight away what was happening in 2020, and what is happening today might also sometimes take a while to see through. But anyone whose heart and mind are in the right place should be able to tell the real from the unreal. If you can't perceive the shadow cast by demons, it means you have not yet properly turned towards the light. Why did the 60s/70s counterculture makes things worse instead of better? Bruce Charlton. At the time of the late 60s and early 1970s, there was a general feeling that, even if the specific content of the counterculture, for example mysticism, radical politics, mind-expanding drugs, astrology, tarot, magic, neo-paganism and witchcraft, crystals, geomancy, flying saucers etc., was not valid, and was risky to health and sanity, such activities might well serve as a first step towards a genuine answer to the problem of alienation and totalitarian bureaucracy, the system. But this did not happen, and instead the counterculture became the new age, and converged with mainstream leftist socio-politics, usually by embracing the sexual revolution through its continual mutations, and then picking the wrong side with later litmus test issues that were being used strategically towards the totalitarian world government that eventually emerged into the open in early 2020. There were what, at the time, sounded like reasonable and plausible arguments as to why the negative critique of the system, and the attempt to achieve an integrated wholeness of personality, were beneficial in themselves and would tend towards even better things. Experience, however, showed that in general this is not happening. The reason is quite simple, which is that socio-political movements such as the counterculture are operating at a relatively superficial level, beneath which are metaphysical assumptions concerning the nature of reality. When these assumptions, which are usually unconscious, and/or regarded as being empirically derived, for example from science, rather than the assumptions they actually are such as to sustain the totalitarian system, then that is what will emerge, no matter how seemingly radical may be a person's surface opinions and lifestyle. That, I believe, is why the 60s radicals became the bureaucrats of the 80s, 90s and into the millennium. And why this process continues. Those on side with the establishment-woke-totalitarian agenda have utterly lost the capacity to evaluate even minimal standards of competence and functionality. Bruce Charlton. Most people, probably nearly everybody who contributes to mainstream public discourse, are on board with the establishment-woke-totalitarian agenda, especially when it comes to the sexual revolution, anti-racism, carbon climate and the other litmus test issues that provide the means for top-down strategic socio-political implementation. Precisely because they put the agenda first and central in their value systems, these people, who are, I stress, most people, normal people, nice people, as well as those with managerial roles and leadership responsibilities, are unable to judge quality. Not just unwilling, but unable. The ability is gone, drowned, dead. They cannot see when people or institutions have failed to reach even the bare minimum of what should be acceptable standards of functionality or ability. They cannot see when some venture, project, movie, war, policy has been a catastrophic failure, and are very likely to celebrate its exemplary success. They cannot see when someone is a bad actor, a not scientist or hopeless engineer, a rubbish artist or mediocre musician. They cannot tell when a corporation is not just failing to be good but actively becoming bad. They cannot even notice when political parties or managers are actively, and by many devices, engaged in destruction of nations, organizations, institutions over which they have power. It is futile to argue with such people, or to try and convince them. We need to understand that this is a case of cannot. They cannot discern good from evil, truth-seeking from gross lies. They regard deliberate ugliness as a higher form of beauty. They regard whatever is most fully leftist as intrinsically high in quality. The totalitarian woke agenda is at the root of their sense of being, their motivations, their worldview, and anyone who tries to discuss values as realities will be regarded as vile, loathsome, and so stupid that they ought never to be listened to. If or when anyone attempts to apply discernment of quality, or to seek the true, virtuous or lovely, and gains the slightest rational or emotional traction, they will feel a kind of slippage of the mind, will become overwhelmed by a suffocating sensation, convulsed by visceral disgust, nausea and loathing, such that the urgent and absolute need is to stop the assault, silence the perpetrator, slander and destroy. It is impossible to overestimate the severity of this condition. Utterly useless, embarrassingly incompetent people, groups and companies can and shall be praised to the skies as paragons of brilliance and originality, and every expression of this crazed ridiculousness will be carried on a tide of warm, fuzzy, floaty, feel-good peer solidarity. The more inverted the expression, the more wonderful the feelings. Welcome to mass and social media, and the mass human intercourse so completely enslaved to it, of 2023. This is what it means to be enthralled to satanic values, inverted values, an anti-system of valuations that are motivated by opposition to God, divine creation, and the good. The Litmus Tests Revisited, or, what do we need to know about someone/some institution? Bruce Charlton. The litmus tests may seem crude and formulaic as a way of discernment applied to a person or institutions, but in reality they are almost the opposite. The litmus tests include the birdemic peck healthism agenda, support of the opponents of the Fire Nation in the ongoing war, anti-racism, pro-sexual revolution, CO2 climate change/warming, and any other form of leftism such as socialism, environmentalism, equality, diversity, libertarianism, etc. The litmus tests refer not so much to specific beliefs, but to the core agenda items of the global totalitarian system, which, properly understood, from a Christian perspective, is evil in its intent, i.e. the dominant system ultimately seeks the damnation of souls, which requires that, in the end, each soul desires and chooses to be damned. Therefore, to fail a litmus test means to be subordinated, in at least one major aspect, although typically many or most of the tests are failed, to the external ideology of evil. When somebody, or some institution, supports one of the litmus test agenda items, this is evidence of value inversion, which is evidence that they are self-subordinated to the dominant external agenda. In a sense, from the perspective of making an overall evaluation of somebody's, or some organization's, affiliation in the spiritual war of this world, this affiliation tells us all we need to know. Are they on the side of God/divine creation/the good, or are they opposed? Anyone who accepts, defends, follows, actively advances any of the litmus tests, has placed his motivations, thinking and actions under external control from those powers who oppose the good. This matter of external control is very significant. Because the world, here, now, is so pervasively and top-down corrupted by evil, all powerful external influences are evil. Therefore, to be externally motivated, including by any large or mainstream church, of a denomination, is to be a part of the agenda of evil. This is evil. Evil is not about niceness or good works or devoutness. Evil is about taking the side of Satan against God. Simple as that. One on the side of good is good, no matter what his personal sins, because anyone on the side of good must have repented his sins, will know, acknowledge, and reject his sins. That is what it means to be good. Such is the nature of litmus tests. They function as an index of whether some person or group has chosen subordination to fundamental, ultimate, external control. As of here and now, only one who seriously seeks to detach himself from external control can be on the side of God, divine creation and the good. Such a detached person may not be on the good side, because he might choose evil from his own inner motivations, but only a detached person can affiliate to good. In our totalitarian and media-saturated world, only inner evaluation and motivation can be a source of commitment to the motivation of goodness. We are good as individuals, from our inner choices, or not at all. Affiliation to any external authority is to subscribe to one, more, or many of the negative, incoherent, and oppositional litmus tests, and this represents a decisive affiliation to the work of Satan. Note added, it should not really be necessary to say so, but maybe it needs saying anyway, that the state of someone's soul now, for example affiliation to the satanic agenda, as evidenced by litmus test failure, does not mean that they will choose damnation at the last. Indeed, I think it almost certain that an individual person is only sustained alive for as long as he is judged capable of repentance, which means that where there is life there is hope. However, the same does not necessarily apply to institutions, groups, corporations, including churches. Whereas there are many, including recent, examples of individual persons, and, presumably, other beings, who seem very likely to have repented and chosen salvation despite previous servitude to evil, and done so very late, very near to death, there seem to be none among recent institutions. This may be because the kind of corruption that afflicts most modern institutions is one that excludes the ultimacy of the kind of presiding spiritual being that used to stand behind traditional institutions, variously conceptualized as patron saints, angels, and the like. I would guess that so long as there is a presiding spiritual being, then repentance is possible. But when there has been a hollowing out, bureaucratization, self-subordination of an institution to external influences, then there can be no basis for repentance. Good and Evil. William Wildblood. I have written on several occasions about the need for a radical revision of our ideas about good and evil and what these fundamental things might be. This gets more important by the day because the current understanding of goodness has become completely distorted with the corresponding sense of evil, and what it really is almost wholly lacking in the modern mind. Basically, good is God. It's that simple. And evil is not God. And not God is effectively Satan. There is no in-between, no middle ground, and if you do not come down positively on the side of God you will inevitably, be drawn onto the side of Satan. This sounds extremely crude, sensationalist and lacking in nuance or, a trap for the intellectually proud, sophistication. But there it is. It's just how things are. However, over the last couple of centuries or so we have been lured into the false idea that good is about worldly good, which means supporting the earthly human being, often at the expense of the spiritual. Thus, good people are kind and compassionate. They are believers in humanity, and the general welfare of all equally. They promote social justice and humanitarian causes. Good is doing as you would be done by and respecting your neighbor, but respecting your neighbor without first loving God is not loving your neighbor, not as he really is. Believing in God means observing his laws. If you love me, keep my commandments. Again, very simple. It's no good saying you believe in God and even thinking you do if you follow a worldly agenda that prioritizes the needs and goals of this world. If you believe in God, you know that his kingdom is not of this world. That doesn't mean you reject the world, but it is not the focus of your main concern. You do not look at life in its light but from a higher perspective. Let me put this another way. What is important is not so much whether you are a good or a bad person in the generally accepted moral sense. I do not say that doesn't matter, but it is not the main thing. What is important is which side you are on, which means which way your heart inclines. Is it that of God and the priorities of the spiritual world, or is it that of this world, which means, in the traditional shorthand, Satan? Anything which does not put God first puts Satan first, and Satan will always, without exception, throw his acolytes under the bus when they no longer serve his purpose, as we are currently seeing. But, that aside, if you do not consciously serve God, you will serve the devil in one way or another. Perhaps not deliberately, as in handing over your soul for worldly advantage, but if you do not swim against the worldly tide, you will eventually be swept down to the sea of lost souls with all the rest. People who are on the side of good may behave badly sometimes. They shouldn't, but they may, though if they do they will repent, because they will see they have not lived up to the standards expected, which are those of the good, the beautiful and the true. People on the side of evil, either consciously or, which is most people, unthinkingly so, may behave impeccably, but they are more likely to admire themselves for doing so. Those on the side of spiritual, true, good know they are sinners. Those on the side of worldly good often think of themselves as by and large pretty decent people, but the closer you come to real good the more you see yourself for what you are, because the image you have built up of yourself is being stripped bare. All good is in God. Nothing outside God can be good. The modern world has become deeply embedded in evil because it rejects God, and even when it allows him it is only on its own terms, which means it doesn't allow him at all. I don't often write about specific current events on this blog, and that's because these are almost irrelevant set against the general trends. The task of the spiritual aspirant is to put himself right on the basic level of aligning his heart and soul and will with the reality and purpose of God. Once that is done, or starts to be done, then other things will fall into place. It's all about first principles. Get those right and you will know the difference between good and evil. Get them wrong, as most do, and you will have no idea, and can be herded and corralled by external forces that manipulate you at their will. This is why the only real freedom is in God. The other exists for self-discovery, not self-annihilation. Francis Berger. Discovering oneself, one's true self, real self, divine self, call it what you will, is one of the underlying purposes of creation. With that in mind, it is clear that this journey of self-discovery involves other beings. If it didn't, God, as a being, as the primary creator, and as a loving parent, would probably have placed us in a creation comprised of isolated, self-contained, hermetically sealed, worlds of one deprived of all contact, communication, and relationships with other beings. The sort of arrangement where we would have no one but ourselves to contend with. No one but ourselves to find and discover. Creation is the polar opposite of that kind of arrangement, which reveals much about the limits of isolated and secluded forms of self-discovery. One of my deepest metaphysical assumptions involves the belief that we existed in self-containment, isolation, seclusion, and aloneness before our mortal lives. However, this condition of perfect freedom represented an extremely low form of consciousness that deadened awareness of ourselves as free beings. We may have been dimly aware of our existence, but we were probably completely unaware of why we existed or what we could do with this existence. We may have had some murky grasp of self, but I suspect this understanding was at best tenuous and intermittent, blinking off as mysteriously and suddenly as it had blinked on, indicating that self-knowledge is unachievable through the self alone. It required other beings. One way to think about creation is to see it as an arrangement in which the self is in continuous contact with other beings or selves, who, as selves in their own right, are in constant contact with other beings or selves. This arrangement inevitably depends upon relationships between beings. It is through these relationships that individual beings can work toward discovering their true selves. Thus, an underlying purpose of creation is to discover oneself through others, which is not the same as the modern altruistic impulse of denying the self for others. I may never fully understand another being in mortal life, but relationships with other beings may help me to know myself. Likewise, another being may never fully understand me as a self, but myself may help the other being better understand itself. Other beings cannot help me to understand myself if they demand I dissolve myself into their selves, nor can I help other beings if they subsume their selves under myself. With this in mind, Christianity is a religion of discovering and fortifying the self, not for self-worship or self-annihilation, but for being or becoming the sort of self that aligns with God, participates in creation through love, and, thereby, adds to and expands both love and creation. We may not be able to achieve this fully in mortal life, But if we believe on Jesus, is misunderstanding the nature of evil the greatest of errors? Bruce Charlton. I have little doubt that for most people in the modern world, evil is defined in terms of inflicting suffering upon other people. Modern attitudes to abortion and euthanasia suggest that the infliction of suffering is regarded as worse than killing, and even the grossest harms of the transgender, mutilation, poisoning, physical suffering of children, are justified in terms of supposedly reducing mental suffering. Christians, or at least, strongly self-identified Christians, have often felt the same way, despite whatever contrary lip service they pay to Christ's kingdom being not of this world. As well as personal hopes, there has been a vast and complexly abstract theology purporting to explain how this world is to be redeemed, remade in ways that include the elimination of all suffering, or indeed assertions that the resurrection of Jesus Christ has actually already improved this world by ways including the reduction of suffering. I.e. the common Christian belief that there has been less suffering in the world because of Jesus than there would have been without Jesus, or that there has been less suffering in Christian societies than in non-Christian. The belief that suffering is the worst evil is certainly sincere, heartfelt, and indeed seems often to overwhelm people with an urgent craving for the elimination, or at least substantial reduction, of suffering in this world, or to overwhelm them with despair that this is no so, and that suffering continues. So far as I can tell, the only answer to such a conviction, to this state of being overwhelmed by the horror of suffering that afflicts so many people, is to stay with the conviction and take it further, until you come out of the other side. The only convincing answer is to imagine, as fully, realistically, and honestly as possible, what kind of a world there would be, or would not be, if the elimination of suffering really were the primary value. Because not being is, indeed, the destination of a morality that intends to eliminate suffering in this world, as this world is constituted, which is, a world in which entropy rules, and death will always eventually prevail. How it is that the imperative of not suffering interacts with our actual mortal world to produce an ethic of not being, is something that each person needs to work through for himself, because humans have an infinite capacity for resisting arguments they do not want to be true. Nonetheless, such is the insight that awaits anyone who allows himself to step out from that state of being overwhelmed, and either frenzied or paralyzed, by the pervasiveness of suffering. I think that only then can we properly understand what Jesus Christ actually offered mankind, which was not directed at this world, but at another. Jesus is indeed reported as saying as much, many times, in the Gospels, but that otherworldliness, that fulfillment in heaven and only in heaven, that second creation, needs to become the basis of our Christian understanding. This is true, even though the amount of evil is commonly measured in terms of dead bodies. For example, the evil of Hitler or Lenin-Stalin is asserted or compared primarily in terms of the numbers of people they deliberately exterminated. Political power, nowadays, is mainly rooted in the authority to define whose suffering matters the most, because this suffering, and its purported alleviation, is the basis of most of the major leftist agendas such as socialism, feminism, pro-homosexualism, the transgender, and anti-racism. If God, nowadays, requires us to be active seekers, this means that the blockages are in me. Bruce Charlton. Modern adult men are not spontaneously religious or, seriously, spiritual, and we are trapped in the alienated state of purposelessness and meaninglessness by our fundamental assumptions concerning the nature of reality. Any Westerner who is a real Christian, has had to achieve this by his own efforts. Whereas, in the past, it seems that God imposed his reality upon most people, and it took effort to reject God. Nowadays we must make the effort. The same applies to much that is true, it does not come naturally. Truth does not overwhelm us, but needs to be sought and won. We must not only meet God halfway, but must, indeed, do most of the work. If, for instance, a modern man wants to perceive God in this world, to know God is real, or to know this world as a creation, he will need to work at it, and this work will quite likely be hard and long. He will need to be persistent. This is the flip side of our freedom. Because we are not spontaneous/passively absorptive, we are free to accept or reject, embrace or ignore. This applies to knowing God as to our politics and ideology. We just are responsible for our beliefs, and responsible in ways that did not apply in the deep past, or even the relatively recent past of a couple of generations ago. We may yearn to provide the kind of good values environment for our children that will enable them, passively and spontaneously, to assimilate Christianity as natural, but usually even this is denied us. And even when it is achieved during childhood, and the child grows surrounded by good influences, the effects seldom survive adolescence, or early adulthood. In 2023 and the West, sooner or later, every real Christian must do it for himself, or else not really be Christian, like the hundreds of millions of devout churchgoers who actively and fundamentally support the agenda of totalitarian evil. The point we need to grasp is that God has not retreated, creation is still as present as ever, even in a modern city, the blockages are in us. We are the problem. What prevents us knowing God is inside ourselves. And this is why it is so difficult. When the blockages are in our own basic assumptions about reality, i.e. our metaphysics, our own habits of thinking, our unconsciously absorbed wrong values etc., then only we can remove these blockages. When we are unable to perceive most of reality, are unable to comprehend the obvious, are dedicated to inversions of the truth and goodness, and when all chance of cure is blocked, then nobody can do the job of correcting these problems except ourselves. That is what it means to be free. It is seldom easy to remove one's own blockages, it usually takes time, effort, and repeated attempts. These blockages, including the most devastating, are hard to discover, because so common, so accepted, such common sense, so, apparently, supported by science. Only if you really dig down to your own deepest assumptions, or maybe notice and take seriously that these blocking ideas are actually modern and local, rather than eternal and universal, are you likely to discover them, and recognize that they are not necessary truths. And the process is not only unsupported by other people who are satisfied with a blocked life, others will often discourage such efforts, and punish the consequences. In 2023, to live without a common blockage is to live in ways that seem stupid, crazy or evil to the majority who choose to remain blocked, and who have decided not to make the significant effort to remove blockages. On the other hand, nobody and nothing can stop you removing the blockages, and perceiving real reality, if you thus choose. That also is the nature of freedom. Doctors, academics and scientists have objectively ceased to exist in the UK, we are all generic bureaucratic functionaries now. Bruce Charlton. The three professions of which I was member have, in reality, long since ceased to exist, but this can now be seen objectively since they are perpetually on strike. Striking means hurting the general public, i.e. patients and students, because nearly all scientists are employed by educational establishments, ostensibly as a stupid, self-destructive way of trying to persuade monopoly employers to give them more pay and better conditions. But in actuality, most as a futile way of venting general frustration at their meaningless and purposeless existence. Professionals don't go on strike because it hurts the people who they, supposedly, exist to serve. So that the endemic state of strike demonstrates that doctors and academics/scientists no longer think of themselves as professionals, and are making a public demonstration of that established fact. They think of themselves as they actually are, bureaucratic functionaries whose core responsibility is to improve their position within their particular bureaucracy. Current industrial action is invariably directed against the public, rather than the managers. The strikers always cooperate, never resist and refuse whatever bureaucratic nonsense the managers currently are imposing. While patients and students suffer, these medical/academic/scientific employees don't really want to hurt the managers, or alienate them, because it is managerial favor they are seeking. And the particular bureaucracies of the National Health Service and UK universities are merely sub-departments of the single, cross-linked global bureaucracy, the system, the matrix. So most people are in exactly the same situation, and behave with identical servile, short-termist, stupid selfishness as the ex-professionals, so let's not hear any arguing from assumed superiority. Whatever apparent superiority currently exists in other jobs is merely temporary and situational. In other words, because of multiple laws and regulations relating to employment, taxes, subsidies, safety, racism/feminism/sexual stuff/disability, sanctions, climate drivel and so on, and ever increasing, all large employers are de facto a single employer, and all those who work for them are generic functionaries, whose job is to do whatever the managers tell them. Therefore, except temporarily, there is no difference between a doctor and anyone else who works for the NHS, nurse, therapist, cleaner, porter, shop assistant etc., and no difference between someone who works for the NHS and someone who works for any other large government department, multinational corporation, NGO, or whatever. And therefore the doctor's job is to do whatever his bosses currently tell him is his job. Same with academics, same with scientists. There is no essence to their work, only obedience. Very nearly all of the ex-professions that I was a member of, now actually do jobs that have almost, or actually, zero overlap with what these professions did 50 years ago. They are all doing different things, because they are doing what managers tell them to do. And the managers do what the politicians, and media moguls, tell them to do, and the politicians do what the real rulers tell them. This is how the world wags. Such is life, such it has been for a couple of decades at least, and, although officially denied, such reality is becoming clearer with each passing year. There are no political, social, national, institutional, religious saviors or protectors in the West, not even in Hungary. Francis Berger. Conservatives, nationalists, Christians, and other individuals holding rightist views continue to heap respect and adulation upon the Hungarian government, often elevating Orbán et al. to lofty heights verging on hero worship. In reality, Orbán and his government craftily maneuver within an illusion they have skillfully constructed to not only dupe the nation they purportedly serve but also delude salivating rightist supporters around the globe, some of whom have gone as far to declare Orbán to be the savior and protector of Hungary, Western civilization, and Christianity. Illusions deserve nothing but shattering, so I'll cut right to chase here. Orbán et al. aren't saving or protecting anything in Hungary, Western civilization, or Christianity. In many ways, the current Hungarian government has done more to harm Hungary, Western civilization, and Christianity than the most rabid, foaming at the mouth radical leftist government could ever hope to do. And it has managed to inflict these harms precisely because it operates from behind a thin, flimsy, and cliched veneer of conservatism, nationalism, and Christianity. Regardless, rightists around the world want to believe in the Hungarian hope, to the point that they conveniently ignore Orbán et al.'s glaring lies, self-contradictions, and malversations, the vast majority of which directly undermine the very conservative, nationalist, and Christian principles the Magyar ruling class professes to uphold and defend. Case in point, the Hungarian government recently made a deal to purchase and nationalize the Liszt International Airport in Budapest using €3.9 billion of public money in a 50-50 ownership deal with BlackRock, yes, that BlackRock, in which the US investment giant would possess management rights. I don't know about you, but that is some odd nationalization. Here's another one. Orban et al. Energetically support the implementation of the WHO Pandemic Treaty and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And let's not forget that Orban's crew was also the first EU country to approve the UN's 2015 climate deal in Paris. They were also terribly disappointed when Trump withdrew the US from the deal in 2017. Of course, Trump, Mr. Drain the Swamp, Make America Great Again, then went on to launch Operation Warp Speed. No, I'm not going to link to support the above. If you are inclined to verify, do it yourself. Listen. Forget this rightist, conservative, Christian social/political bullshit. There are no political, corporate, media, institutional, religious, or social saviors and protectors in the West, so stop searching for them. They are all of the system, by the system, for the system, regardless of their stripe or bent. The sooner you accept that, the freer you will be to focus your energy elsewhere. So-called AI represents a judgment on the degradation of post-millennial life. Bruce Charlton. I recently watched yet another, this time video, presentation on the wonders and dangers of the new kinds of AI, artificial intelligence, and yet again felt that this phenomenon mostly reveals how degraded, and unhuman, has our world become over the past 30 years. Degraded, bureaucratized, dehumanized, and de-skilled to such an extent that mediocre simulations can replace people without very much loss of discernible quality. Which just goes to show that when creativity and judgment are systemically excluded, personnel are systematically degraded, real human contact is displaced by the virtual, and quality is driven sufficiently far down, then computers can, almost undetectably, substitute for the resulting output. Permacrisis requires permacompetence. Francis Berger. The Collins English Dictionary word of the year for 2022 was permacrisis. I'm not sure what words the fine folks at HarperCollins have shortlisted for the 2023 word of the year, but here is my suggestion for their expert consideration: permacompetence, that is, permanent incompetence. Sure, permacompetence is not word, as if permacrisis is, and has not entered the flow of general usage. However, it should, because it aptly describes the ubiquitous ineptitude saturating the system, more specifically, virtually all governments, organizations, institutions, and corporations. I suspect HarperCollins chose named Permacrisis as its 2022 word of the year to help broadcast the establishment's continuing and overarching goal of using cascading crises as pretexts for locking the world in a nightmarish ironic totalitarian surveillance state. Many conspiracy-inclined bloggers have compared these permacrisis modes of operation to the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or, more plainly, problem, reaction, solution. The process is simple enough. Create a problem or crisis, incite the masses to react in a predetermined fashion, and then offer a solution to that quells the instigated reaction, and solves the manufactured problem. Every establishment permacrisis solution aims to further consolidate the system's power by increasing bureaucratic despotism and eroding freedom. The master plan appeared to come together via the birdemic in 2020 to 2021. The Áromanic totalitarians succeeded in locking the world down for nearly 2 years. During that time, they proclaimed that the world would never again be as open as it had been. They did their utmost to convince people that measures, such as global digital IDs, pet passports, restricted travel, curfews, intermittent lockdowns, and so forth, would become permanent fixtures of the post-birdemic world. They even successfully implemented such measures in some places, yet they couldn't make it permanent. They had the world seemingly at their mercy. The totalitarian prison they had been dreaming about for decades was on the cusp of becoming an indissoluble reality, but in the end, it slipped through their fingers. The explanations for this failure to close the totalitarian deal are numerous. Many factors undoubtedly played a part, but I believe good old incompetence was principal among them. Yes, incompetence. Granted, it required a high level of competence and coordination to pull the birdemic off, but the incompetence bled through the moment the establishment seized control. For the sake of brevity, I won't wade into endless details. Instead, I will simply note that the permacrisis world the establishment seeks to implement requires permacompetence. Global totalitarianism entails consistent and committed proficiency, capability, and expertise. The establishment appears to have a severe shortage of these indispensable qualities. What they appear to have an abundance of is permacompetence. On the one hand, I guess you could consider this a blessing of sorts because it is practically guaranteed that none of their totalitarian dreams will ever come to full fruition. On the other hand, permacompetence is extremely capable of one thing: destruction. The Ahrimanics only win if they are permacompetent. Permacompetence is the realm of Sorot and the potential for an authentic, genuine permacrisis. Equality means all mountains must be leveled. William Wildblood. By no means equal. I should add that the book looks at the idea of equality from a spiritual or metaphysical position rather than a political, ideological, social or whatever stance. But that's the only way to look at anything. The reason people make mistakes in their beliefs is because they have failed to engage properly with the level of first principles. Get those right and everything falls into place. Get them wrong and everything is wrong. Even ideas that may be right in essence become wrong if your reason for holding them is based on faulty premises. We live at a time when the idea of equality is pushed by the establishment as a way of diminishing the individual rather than raising him up. Of course, it's the latter aspect that is presented as the driving force behind it all, but the real motivation is to reduce humanity to a controllable mass dominated by a small elite served by a large bureaucracy of system enforcers who cooperate and conform for a slice of the pie. This is why such things as racism and sexism have become the deadly sins of our secular age. Anything that might resist the assault on freedom, intellectual at the moment, no doubt more later on, or stand for higher values must be attacked and shamed. Those groups best able to do this are the ones who represent a threat to the narrative and must be undermined. Things can only be equal when everything is at ground level. Equality does not mean justice. It means slavery. The spiritual consequences of truth-indifference. Bruce Charlton. I have been contemplating again, albeit not yet rereading, the highly suggestive series of World War I lectures by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Karma of Untruthfulness, which might be translated as The Spiritual Consequences of Truth-Indifference. One of Steiner's core ideas is that the Great War was a direct consequence, i.e. karmic outcome, of the preceding decades of untruthfulness, untruthfulness being a highly useful term that encompasses deliberate misrepresentations, distortion, cover-ups, and all forms of ignoring realities, as well as outright lies. Well, I suppose that there has never been a time in history when there have been so many, such large untruthfulnesses, so widely believed as now. And by Steiner's understanding, and my own, this must and shall have very large and negative karmic consequences, at every level at which untruthfulness is propagated and believed, from the global and national, down to institutional and individual. This is inescapable. Untruthfulness has been built into so many civilizations, societies, institutions and lives, that its consequences are unavoidable, and will be encountered for considerable time to come. What this means, initially for each of us as individuals, but also for every form of organization, corporation, bureaucracy, is that the quest for truth, leading toward explicit repentance based on understanding of untruthfulness, ought to be a primary and core activity of every life. No matter how truthful you currently regard yourself, for example by comparison with other people, there is a lot of work for you to do. In doing the work of truth, we not only benefit ourselves, spiritually, but, because right thinking is a kind of power, we benefit everybody, and everything else. Signs of the effectiveness of an ideology or religion: thriving institution, life-changing, gratifying, or strengthening. Bruce Charlton. What I look for in evaluating the success or effectiveness of an ideology or religion or any kind of spiritual activity, is that it is strengthening. All the rest of the indices are pretty useless as of 2023, although they may well have been valid at various points in the past. A thriving institution is nowadays, nearly always, merely a measure of its approval rating with the global totalitarian regime, since the system sustains only what advances its agenda of evil, and will otherwise keep an institution small and weak, in material terms, when it does not assimilate, or destroy it. Therefore indices such as expansion, growth of numbers, profits, new building, approval ratings or viewings, increased influence, greater status, prizes, awards, prestige, such things mean little more than that one is an insider to evil. That something is measurably life-changing is of somewhat more relevance, but only when the induced change is for the good. There are plenty of life-changing events, artifacts etc. that are merely increasing conformity to the agenda, or corrupting people into greater acceptance and approval of sin. It is much easier to make people worse than to make them better. For instance, it is easy, given enough resources, to increase people's fear, resentment or despair, but very difficult indeed to improve their lovingness, courage, and transcendental hope. Much the same applies to something that improves happiness, gratification, satisfaction, motivation. This is again somewhat closer to where we want to be, yet in the world as it is now, most things that make people feel better and more energetic are bad things that will lead then to a much worse situation. Such is clearly the case for the liberations and rights of the sexual revolution. Short-term people feel better, have more fun, but long-term, nihilism. Or any modern political movement that engages peoples and sets them to work. At first there is a sense of community, belonging, a mission. But pretty soon activists become among the very worst of people, characterized by shame, guilt, self-hatred, self-destructiveness. Desirous of escape, insensibility, death, and their own, plus general, destruction. The most valid, although still incomplete, benefit seems to me to be strengthening in the cause of good. The strength can be most readily seen negatively, in terms of not being enlisted into the agendas of totalitarian evil, of passing the litmus tests for example. Conversely, the utter uselessness of most institutions, churches, religious systems, spiritual disciplines, such as meditation, etc. can now be clearly seen by the fact that the organizations and their adherents fail the litmus tests en masse, that they always go along with whatever current evil policy is being pushed, they always believe what the establishment currently most want them to believe, they are self-blinded against, uninterested by, and in denial of whatever is truly important and most threatening in the world, preferring instead to focus on imaginary threats and total lies. It is harder to discern, and measure, positive strengthening in others, without a direct, and loving, personal relationship, but it is necessary to have such strength in order to pursue good, and to live by one's destiny, in a world endemically evil. Such strengthening is what we should seek for ourselves. Because to be useful here and now, as things are, it seems to me that our choices of affiliation, religion, spiritual practice, whatever, need not only to be abstractly, and overall, correct by our best evaluations. But, if our beliefs are to be of real use, they must also be personally, and if this is possible, institutionally, strengthening. Without positive strength, however right our religion, we shall be lost, if indeed it has not already happened. The intrinsic validity of so-called AI is analogous to the authority of bureaucracy, that is, it has zero validity. Bruce Charlton. AI, so-called artificial intelligence, is just the latest version of a phenomenon I have spent most of my working life understanding and arguing against. That phenomenon appears in various guises including bureaucracy, voting, statistics applied to understanding, quality management, guidelines. I have given up on trying to explain why all of these are wrong when used to make decisions, to achieve insights, to monitor and regulate practices in government. I have given up because it has become evident that the belief in such technologies is a matter of faith. It is an expression of deep and self-destructive, as well as socially destructive, ideals. Their wrongness is innate and objective, and can be proved, but first we need to understand these phenomena, and extremely few genuinely wish to understand. If you are sufficiently interested to make the effort, word search these on this blog and read the links. But, really, this stuff would not need explaining, if men were properly orientated. Most people are happily under the spell cast by these technologies/methods and their apologists. They believe because they want to believe, therefore they are strongly resistant to understanding. This is a civilization that is killing itself, and one major manifestation of this death wish is that people persist in seeking some kind of technological or methodological technique of making judgments. Thus, people under the spell of AI are obviously enchanted by the idea that we can have computers/machines/systems which will make judgments, do learning, create poems/pictures/stories, discover, implement values, organize people, etc., etc. Behind such claims, and the eager credulity that welcomes them, there is a not-so-covered desire for human self-annihilation. A lot of people apparently want to hand over all the highest, greatest, most divine aspects of being a man, and they are prepared to give their faith to anyone who claims that this can and should be done. Because all this is ultimately a matter of faith. We now have a world of bureaucracy, with most major decisions made by voting, because that is where people have put their faith, their ultimate faith. People's faith is to believe, without any coherent logic, or honest evidence, and contrary to vast experience, that bureaucratic organization and voting are superior to the judgment of individual human beings. And so the world is organized, and whatever happens to the world, that faith remains intact. Our desire to be rid of human judgment is, at root, an expression of our rejection of God. This is why it is so pervasive, why it is a matter of faith, and why it will destroy us. We cannot be awoken from a spell that we have chosen to succumb to. Note added 30 September 23rd, it strikes me that with the advent of AI we have, as it were, officially entered a world in which public discourse consists of parroting, of uncomprehending computer parrots speaking to other parrots, some computers, some humans, who cannot comprehend the parroted stimuli, because, strictly, there is nothing to comprehend, but which generate even more parroted responses. On and on, until the night comes. AI is simply the latest manifestation of materialism. William Wildblood. Bruce Charlton has a recent piece on the subject of AI, something about which, I must confess, I know next to nothing. But I do know a little about computer technology, which is the basis of AI, and I also have enough spiritual understanding to realize that AI is just another poisoned chalice, something that will suck us into its orbit because of its spurious attractions and the ease it offers to lazy minds. I am pretty lazy myself, but at least I know it's a fault that, if indulged in, leads to inertia, which is another form of death. I was encouraged by Bruce's post to offer a short comment which ran as follows: AI is simply the latest manifestation of materialism, latest and worst because it is the fullest denial so far of spirit. It is humanity rejecting the reality of soul and farming out its consciousness to the machine. This is the modern cult of death in its grimmest form to date because it is a renunciation of both individuality and freedom. Neither can exist in a computer, and the more we embrace this technology, the more we lose connection to what actually makes us human. When will we learn that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should? But we will do it. Naturally, there will be the usual round of fake debate in which we question the use of AI and wonder if the robots will take over the world and destroy humanity, but we will go ahead and everyone will eagerly hop on board just as they did with computers and smartphones. The machine will have made further inroads into our consciousness, and we will have separated ourselves even more from the reality of spirit. This is part of the ongoing descent into a world of pure quantity in which nothing exists that cannot be measured. Human creativity will be put in a box with its lid firmly fastened. We will be told that AI and creativity can run alongside each other, but it doesn't work like that. You either acknowledge the reality of spirit, in which case AI will be recognized as anti-spirit, or you ignore it, in which case you enter a world in which everything is counted, controlled, numbered and known. That is a form of death because it denies freedom, which is life. Direct knowing is front-loaded. Bruce Charlton. I become more convinced that direct knowing is required of us, unmediated intuiting, the sharing of common thoughts, and indeed the only way of knowing that works in a world where language, symbols, visions, and all kinds of perceptual experience are corrupted as well as weakened. Furthermore, that this direct knowing is what might be called front-loaded, which means that most of the effort comes up front and in terms of formulating the proper question, the question that we need to know, and the answer to which we can understand at a single grasp. Direct knowing must be as simple as each of us personally happens to be, and that will vary between people, simple enough to grasp in a single mental act of comprehension, because anything else is not real understanding, but merely a kind of parroting. It is all about asking the right question, because once the right question has been formulated, the answer is obvious, and valid. Valid within the limits of our own personal comprehension and needs. Asking the right question is itself a very difficult thing. The right question is almost never to be found in the public domain, nor in the standard discourse of traditionalism, because these are backloaded discourses, in which the usual thing is for people to be utterly swamped up front by vast volumes of mostly incomprehensible answers, and nearly all the effort goes into try to sort between the answers, and understand their implications, consider the standard sermon, or equivalent teaching. Also, traditional Christian, and other, spiritual discourse is very often characterized by asking the wrong questions, for instance asking too many questions, or what should be subsidiary questions, when the fundamental questions have still not been answered. In a nutshell, the deep metaphysical questions of traditional Christianity are very seldom understood or correct, and this is why we still have the same problems with mainstream Christian theology as they did nearly 2,000 years ago. Questions that have plagued me, personally, and for which I regard the traditional answers as inadequate, include, explaining the divine and human nature of Christ, the problem of monotheism and the pseudo-solution of the Trinity, the origin of evil and suffering, the hardly broached matter of the uniqueness of each man, the aliveness of all created reality. Thus, the spiritual practice of direct knowing can feel like it is going nowhere, since it is low volume, with few answers, and simple, the answers so easy that we can grasp them in a moment. But, we can only truly understand the answer and what it means, when we have ourselves formulated the question. Getting told the answer to somebody else's question is usually incomprehensible, no matter how, apparently, simple that question may be, since we do not know, that is, know from within, the context of that question, its purpose and relevance. The quest for direct knowing can seem, and often is, a lot of work immediately and without much to show subsequently in terms of quantity of intuitively solid knowledge. Whereas archaic and traditional practice provides apparently endless stimulation by inputs of many kinds, direct knowing instead expects to discard almost all of this, or even all of it, in some areas, sooner or later. But nobody except ourselves can do this work of this evaluating and selecting, and perhaps even creating. Yet if the answer we need and that is true is necessary, then we can be sure that we personally will have the creative capacity to generate, to create, invent it. Why and how can we be sure? Because this matching of question to answer happens, as it were, automatically, as a consequence of the very process itself. Because what we seek must be wholly comprehensible to us, as we are, and therefore, even if we are a very simple and ignorant person, we will necessarily be able to discover exactly the kind of simple answer that is, after all, the only one we could fully understand. Necessarily because our God is the Creator, is good, and is our Heavenly Father, I would say Heavenly Parents, who loves us personally and individually. Therefore we can be absolutely sure that our condition in this mortal life will certainly contain everything required for our salvation and for learning whatever we need to learn. All of the requisite ingredients are there, are here, it is up to us to use them. Did the birdemic succeed in destroying the churches? Pretty much. Bruce Charlton. At the start of the birdemic global coup in March 2020, I predicted that the Christian churches would, intentionally, be extremely hard hit by the lockdowns. The Church of England bishops ensured maximum harm of their institution, by imposing what I think were the most extreme and irrational set of lockdown rules of any British institution. The above data suggests that this combined effort from the UK government and bishops was effective, to the tune of increasing the increment of already existing declining church attendance by an extra 25% approximately. When I became a Christian shortly before 2009, the Church of England had about 1 million a week attending church, from a population of around 60 million, and by 2022, without lockdown this would have been expected to have declined to about 810,000. Whereas, thanks to lockdowns, masks, abolished sacraments etc., the actual decline was to 605,000. So, apparently, the anti-church birdemic measures successfully deleted a couple of 100,000 church attenders, as if adding about a dozen extra years of decline. Of course, the rate of decline of the Church of England has been so fast anyway, that it is headed for extinction within a generation. And this numerical decline does not take into account the fact that most of church attenders in the Church of England, as in all the other mainstream self-identified Christian churches, have explicitly taken the anti-Christian side of global atheistic totalitarian leftism, when it comes to the decisive litmus test issues. Causal trends are established, it is too late for reversal to be possible, and the organization is ruled and staffed, overwhelmingly, by generic politically radical bureaucrats, whose actions betray very obvious hostility to religion. Indeed, we are seeing the unfolding karma deriving from multiple wrong decisions made several decades ago. Again, the same pattern and trends are seen across all the churches. My conclusion, the future of Christianity in the UK will either be located outside the churches, or else there will be no future. When will Christianity reignite the West? Francis Berger. I don't know, but I suspect it will only come after the. What are you going to do to protect me in this world? Question becomes anathema in Christian discourse. Wrong questions rarely, if ever, lead to right answers. A comment by Francis Berger. Bruce Charlton. A comment by Francis Berger yesterday included the significant statement that wrong questions rarely, if ever, lead to right answers. This is important, because the opposite is so often assumed. For instance, the idea that it doesn't much matter what is our question, because all paths will eventually lead to the truth. Or the related idea that a good way to lead someone to follow Jesus is to encourage him to ask questions, and answer each of them as they arise. Another version is the idea that the open arena of public assertion, counter-assertion and debate will tend to lead, by a kind of natural selection, to the emergence of truth. But if wrong questions do not lead to right answers, then these common assumptions are dangerously false. If, instead, truth is to be known by asking the right question, then this frantic business of challenge and response needs to stop, and people should instead be thinking about the questions they are asking, why they ask this question, what assumptions it is based on, what kind of answer they seek, and what they propose to do with an answer. Instead of comparing and critiquing, we need to focus primarily on asking the one right question. The business of a spiritual or philosophical quest, indeed the whole business of mortal life itself, takes on a transformed complexion when we recognize that the question is more important than the answer, and that wrong questions don't lead to right answers, no matter how many times they are multiplied. We shouldn't crack our brains puzzling over answers, but over questions. A properly formed question will answer itself, and in ways that we understand immediately, although implications of the answer will unfold through time. Furthermore, this explains why we cannot rely on external authorities to supply us either with questions, or with answers, since we ourselves must fully understand the question, in order fully to understand the answer. If we do not do it for ourselves, it will not be done. Air creativity is anti-spiritual creativity. Francis Berger. William Wildblood recently shared some insightful observations regarding AI. The machine will have made further inroads into our consciousness, and we will have separated ourselves even more from the reality of spirit. This is part of the ongoing descent into a world of pure quantity in which nothing exists that cannot be measured. William touches upon a crucial point here. Human creativity relates to the natural world, as it invents machines and technology from material elements. In this sense, all technological developments serve as phases in man's spiritual development. At the same time, technological development can lead to or increase humanity's enslavement to the purely material, to objects in the world. This is particularly true when humanity turns its back on spiritual aims and values and looks to technological miracles to supply life with ultimate meaning. Unfortunately, when man is no longer motivated by spiritual aims and values, he finds ultimate meaning in things like utility, hedonism, altruism, and, above all, organization. Quality is sacrificed for quantity. Everything becomes a numbers game. Organizing and controlling the numbers becomes the biggest game of all. Human creativity will be put in a box with its lid firmly fastened. We will be told that AI and creativity can run alongside each other, but it doesn't work like that. You either acknowledge the reality of spirit, in which case AI will be recognized as anti-spirit, or you ignore it, in which case you enter a world in which everything is counted, controlled, numbered and known. That is a form of death because it denies freedom, which is life. This is vital. We have entered a phase in which we are called upon to become divinized co-creators of reality, but this entails recognizing and working from the primacy of the spiritual. It requires firm alignment and commitment to God and creation, because only properly oriented and aligned agency and freedom can nurture the sort of love needed for true spiritual co-creation. The inherent danger in AI is that it works in the opposite direction. It increases the already gaping spiritual gap separating man from creation and decreases human freedom and agency, which then lowers human creativity. The allure of AI lies in its apparent creativity, But whatever creativity AI produces is a misguided and false replacement for the sort of creativity God requires of us in this time and place. The creativity God desires from us inevitably pulls us closer to creation and the purposes of creation. This sort of creativity frees as its alignment with God and creation increases. AI creativity is antithetical to these aims. Instead of freeing toward God via creativity, AI creativity further enslaves man to materialism.